He helped her, not knowing she ruled the galaxy and was richer than any queen alive. The crash came without warning. One moment, the shuttle was cutting through the upper atmosphere above Ridgefield, Colorado. The next, it was a fireball punching through low clouds, spinning end over end, shedding pieces of itself across 2 miles of dry mountain scrubland. It hit the ridge east of Dan Kowalski's property line, and the sound rolled over his cabin like a thunderclap that kept going. Dan was already pulling on his boots before the echo died. He grabbed his emergency kit, the old canvas one his father had packed and repacked every summer, threw it over his shoulder, and ran. He was 51 years old, built like a man who had spent 3 decades doing physical work and not much else, and he covered the half-mile to the crash site in under 6 minutes. He did not slow down. The shuttle had come to rest in a shallow gully between 2 rock faces. It was not like any aircraft Dan had ever seen. No manufacturer markings he recognized. The hull was made of something that looked like ceramic but rang like iron when a piece of debris struck it, and the whole wreck was giving off a low vibration he felt in his back teeth then heard with his ears. Smoke poured from a split along the belly, something pale and sharp-smelling, like ozone and copper wire. He did not stop to think about what it was. He went in through the largest breach in the hull, a jagged opening about 4 feet across where the frame had peeled outward like a tin can. Inside, the light was wrong. Dim and bluish, coming from strips along the ceiling that flickered in and out. The interior was sleek in a way that made Dan's own truck look like a cave painting. He could see that immediately. Her chest was moving. One arm hung at an angle that meant it was broken. There was a cut along her hairline, not deep but bleeding freely the way head wounds do, and the blood was running into one eye, and she was too stunned to wipe it away. She was also wearing clothes Dan had no frame of reference for. A suit of some material that was not fabric, not exactly, with no visible seams and no visible fasteners. It moved with her like a second skin. He did not comment on any of it. He said, "I'm going to get you out. Can you hear me?" She turned her head toward him. Her eyes were dark and very steady for someone who had just survived a crash. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they are still deciding whether to trust. "I can hear you," she said. Her accent was unlike anything he had heard before, each word shaped with a precision that made English sound like it was being translated from somewhere else, somewhere older. "Is there anyone else on board?" "No." "Any part of this thing going to explode in the next 2? "Probably not." "Good enough," Dan said, and got to work on the harness. It took him 4 minutes to figure out the release mechanism, another 3 to get her arm stabilized with the splint from his kit, and 2 more to get her out of the seat and moving toward the opening. She bit down hard on whatever pain she was feeling and did not make a sound he did not ask her to. He respected that more than he had words for. Outside in the cold air, she sat on a flat rock and let him wrap her arm properly. He pressed a clean cloth to the cut on her head and told her to hold it there. She watched him work. "You live near here?" she asked. "Half-mile west." "You came alone." "Fastest option." She looked at him for a moment with those. Then she looked at the wreck of her shuttle, and something moved across her face that she did not. "I need to contact my people," she said. "My communication device is inside. In the compartment behind the pilot's seat, left side." Dan stood up. "I'll get it. It will not look like anything you have seen before." "Nothing about the last 20 minutes has looked like anything I've seen before," he said. "Describe the shape." She described it. He went back in. The smoke was thickening, and the vibration in his teeth was getting worse. But the compartment she had described was intact, and he found the device exactly where she said it. It was small, flat, and warm to the touch in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. He did not press any. He brought it out and placed it in her good hand. She looked at the device. Then she looked at him. "Thank you," she said. It did not sound like a courtesy. It sounded like something she did not say often. "You got a name?" Dan asked. "Can you walk?" "I can walk." "Then let's get you to the cabin. It's warmer, and I have a first aid kit that is slightly more advanced than this one." He picked up. She was taller than he had realized, and she moved even through the pain with a kind of contained economy, nothing wasted. Like someone who had learned a very long time ago that efficiency was its own form of dignity. They walked west, toward his cabin, through the dry scrub and the cold mountain air. Dan did not ask her where her shuttle had come from. He did not ask about the technology or the accent or the suit with no seams. He asked if her arm was hurting too much, if she needed to slow down, if she wanted him to carry the device. She said no to all 3. She kept pace with him the whole way. Overhead, very high and very fast, 3 points of light moved in perfect formation across the sky, changed direction in a way no aircraft he knew could manage, and disappeared into the dark. Lena noticed that he noticed. She said nothing either. They reached the cabin just as the temperature dropped another 4 degrees and the first stars of the evening appeared above the ridge. Dan held the door open. He followed and shut out the cold. He put water on for coffee, because it was what you did when someone was in shock and trying not to show it, and because it gave his hands something useful to accomplish while his brain worked through what his eyes had seen. Whatever this woman was carrying, whatever she was running from or running toward, it was larger than anything that had ever landed on his property before. He poured the coffee. She sat at his kitchen table, device in her good hand, and for one unguarded second, she looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the crash. Dan set the cup in front of her and did not ask a single question. That, more than anything, was what she would remember later. 2 days passed before anyone came looking. Dan had expected military. Men in dark uniforms with credentials they would not fully explain and questions they would ask, without answering any in return. He had spent 2 decades as a contractor working adjacent to government projects, and he knew how. What came instead, on the morning of the 3rd day, was a single vehicle, moving up the dirt road to his cabin at a speed that said whoever was driving it did not need to worry about being stopped. One person got out. He was young, maybe 30, wearing civilian clothes that were slightly too good for the setting, and his expression was the expression of someone who had spent his entire professional life being the calmest person in every room he entered. Dan opened the door. "Mr. Kowalski," the young man said, "my name is Pete Hale. I work with Lena. I am here to collect her and to speak with you briefly, if you are willing." Behind Dan, from the kitchen table where she had been eating the breakfast he had made, Lena said, "Let him in, Dan." Dan stepped aside. Pete Hale walked in, saw Lena, and the professionalism on his face cracked for exactly 1 second. He crossed the room and said something to her in a language that was not any language Dan had heard in his life, and she responded in the same language, calm and quiet. And whatever she said made Pete Hale close his eyes briefly and nod. Then he turned back to Dan. "She told me what you did," Pete said, "at the crash site. It wasn't complicated." "No." Pete looked at him steadily. "Which is the part that interests us?" Dan poured coffee for Pete without being asked, because it was still morning and because it gave him something to do, while he decided how much of this conversation he intended to have. "Interests who exactly?" Dan asked. Pete and Lena exchanged a look. It was the kind of look that carries weight. The kind that happens between 2 people when one of them is deciding how much to tell a third. Lena made the decision. She set down her fork. She looked at Dan across the kitchen table where he had fed her breakfast for 2 mornings and let her sleep in the room he used for storage and asked no questions that she did not volunteer. "I am going to tell you something," she said, "and I would like you to hear it before you react." Dan pulled out the chair across from her and, "All right," he said. Not all at once. She was not from Colorado. She was not from Earth. She was not, technically, from this arm of the galaxy at all, though the word galaxy came out of her mouth with a weight that suggested she used it the way other people used the word neighborhood. She had been traveling in a small craft because large craft drew attention, and she had not wanted attention on this particular trip for reasons she did not elaborate on yet. The crash had been the result of a targeting system malfunction, not an accident in the ordinary sense, and the people who had caused the malfunction were still, as of that morning, unidentified. She had been in danger. Dan said, "And now?" "Now they know I survived," she said. "Pete's arrival means the location is no longer contained. We need to move." Dan nodded slowly. He looked at his coffee cup. He looked at the kitchen window, through which he could see the ridge and the thin line of smoke that was still rising from the crash site half a mile east. "Where are you moving to?" he asked. "That depends," Lena said, "on whether you are willing to come with us." Pete Hale, to his credit, kept his expression perfectly neutral at that. Whatever he thought of that offer, he did not put it on his face. Dan looked at her. 2 days of watching this woman sit at his table, eat his food, sleep under his roof, speak to no one, show nothing she did not choose to show. And he had built up a picture of her the way you build a picture of anyone through small. She did not waste words. She did not perform gratitude or warmth or charm. Everything she offered was actual. "Why?" he asked. "Because someone tried to kill me and does not know you exist," she said. "And because you are the first person in 11 years who helped me without knowing who I am." That landed on the table between them and sat there. "Who are you?" Dan asked. Pete Hale looked at the ceiling. Lena said, "I govern 43 inhabited systems. I hold the trade agreements for 61 more. The resource index under my administration is larger than the economic output of every nation on your planet combined and has been for longer than your country has existed." Silence. Outside, a crow landed on the fence post by the garden and made its flat mechanical sound and flew. "So," Dan said finally, "not from Colorado." The corner of Lena's mouth moved. It was barely a smile. Not from Colorado. Dan stood up. He picked up his coffee cup and walked to the sink and looked out at the ridge for a moment. He thought about his cabin, which he had built mostly himself. He thought about his truck, which needed a new alternator. He thought about the points of light he had watched move across the sky on the first night. The ones that changed direction in ways that no aircraft should be able to change direction. He thought about the woman sitting at his table who governed 43 worlds and had sat quietly in his spare room for 2 days and eaten scrambled eggs and said thank you like she meant. He put his cup down. "I'll need 20 minutes to pack," he said. They left in Pete's vehicle and drove 40 minutes north to a location Dan would later describe as a field that should have been empty, but was not. What was in the field did not look like a spacecraft. It looked like a structure that had decided to be a spacecraft for the moment and could change its... It was large enough that looking at it directly produced a mild cognitive resistance, the way very large numbers do when you try to hold them in your head all at once. Dan got out of the vehicle and stood in front of it and breathed. Pete watched him with the practiced patience of someone who had watched many people have this. Lena stood beside Dan. "First time?" she asked. "Seeing something like this?" She did not tell him it would feel normal soon, because she was not the kind of person who said things she did not believe. "It will not feel normal soon," she said, "but you will get used to it. There is a difference." They went inside. The interior was vast in a way the exterior had not fully promised. The ceilings were high. The corridors were wide. The surfaces absorbed light rather than reflecting it, which should have made the space feel dark, but instead made it feel deep. Like looking into water rather than looking at a wall, 12 people were waiting in what Dan would eventually learn to call the operations deck, though that name was a rough translation of the actual term and lost some precision in transit. All 12 of them turned when Lena walked in. Some of them looked at her the way Pete had looked at her in the cabin, with the crack of relief behind professional calm. Others looked at her the way you look at the return of something foundational, but structural, the way a building looks restored when a load-bearing wall is put back. She spoke to them briefly. She introduced Dan in one sentence. Then she turned to him. "We will find who targeted my craft," she said, "and we will handle it. While we do, you are my guest. You will be safe. You will be given anything you need." She paused. "I do not say that to be polite. I say it because I owe you something I cannot calculate, and I intend to begin paying it." Dan looked around the operations deck, at the 12 people who ran 43 worlds and 61 trade agreements, at the surfaces that absorbed light, at the quiet, controlled hum of something vast and powerful that did not need to announce itself. He put his hands in his jacket pockets. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I saw a person who needed help. That's the whole of it." Lena looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said quietly. "That is exactly what makes it significant." On the 4th day aboard the ship, which Dan had stopped trying to understand architecturally and started simply navigating by memory, Pete Hale brought him a file. Not a physical file. A display that appeared in the air in front of Dan's chair in what Pete called the common room and what Dan called the room with the window that looked at stars. "We identified the targeting system that brought down her shuttle," Pete said. He sat across from Dan, elbows on knees, that practiced calm of his, carrying more tension than usual. "It traces back to a consortium. They have been trying to destabilize Lena's administration for 8 years. Every time they get close, she closes the avenue and opens 3 new ones they have to worry about instead." "Is she in danger now?" Dan asked. "She is always in a version of danger," Pete said. "The degree fluctuates." He paused. "Right now it is higher than we would like." Dan looked at the stars in the window that was not. "What can I do?" he asked. Pete looked at him carefully. "What do you mean?" "I spent 20 years doing contract work for projects where I was not told the full picture," Dan said. "You learn to be useful inside incomplete information. I am not asking to be briefed on things that are not my business. I am asking what, in this situation, is something I can actually do that would help." Pete was quiet for a moment. "You are remarkably good at being where you are," Pete said finally, "without needing it to be something else. 30 years of living with just what's there." "Lena trusts you," Pete said. "She does not trust easily, and she does not trust slowly when she does. With her, it is either never or immediate. She trusted you at the crash site." "She trusted me to get her out of a broken shuttle," Dan said. "That's practical, not personal." "She slept," Pete said. "In your spare room." "She has not slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in 14 months. Dan absorbed that. "The people targeting her," he said. "They know about this ship?" "Yes." "They know she's on it?" "Yes." "They know where the ship is?" Pete paused 1 beat too long. "That," he said carefully, "is what we are currently determining." Dan stood up. The stars were very still and very far away, and they did not care at all about the small, urgent, human dramas passing through the space between them. Dan had always found that comforting rather than cold. "Then we should probably be doing something other than talking," he said. For the first time since the cabin, his professionalism cracked without closing back up immediately. "Down that corridor," he said. "Third door on the left. Lena is running the situation assessment. She has been asking, every 40 minutes, whether you were awake yet." Dan did not react to that visibly, and he did not look back. The third door on the left opened into a room where 12 people stood around a display that floated at chest height and showed a map of something too large to be a planet and too detailed to. Lines connecting them like a web that had been built over decades and was now under pressure at. Lena stood at the center of it. She was running it the way Dan had run emergency response on difficult job sites. Not by commanding and waiting, but by processing and redirecting, catching information as it came in and routing it before it bottlenecked. Her broken arm was in a rigid support that Pete's medical people had fitted 2 days prior. She was using it anyway, gesturing through the display with the careful economy of someone who had assigned each movement A. She glanced up when Dan entered. "You slept?" she said. It was not a question. 8 hours, he said. "Good." She looked back at the display. "Come here." He crossed the room and stood beside her. "This node," she said, pointing to a cluster of intersecting lines on the left side of the display, "is where the consortium operates their primary communications relay. We cannot touch it directly. 3 of the 4 parties have treaty protections that would create larger problems than the ones we already have." Dan studied the display. He did not understand the labels. He understood the shape of the problem. "What happens," he said, "if this node goes dark on its own? Just dark." Lena looked at him. "Their coordination breaks down," she said. "Each of the 4 parties loses visibility on what the others are doing. They cannot synchronize, and they start protecting their own interests instead of the shared." "Yes." "So the question is not how to hit the node," Dan said. "The question is what makes a communications relay go dark without anyone hitting it." The room, Pete, from somewhere behind Dan, said nothing. Lena was looking at Dan with an expression that was not surprise exactly, but was adjacent to it. "You have something in mind," she said. "I have half of something," Dan said. "Oh, I need to know more about how the relay is powered," she told him. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked 2 questions. Then he nodded slowly. "When I was working contracts," he said, "there was a power substation project in Wyoming. 3 redundant systems that all fed from the same primary source, so the redundancy was decorative. One fault in the primary and everything looked like it was running until it wasn't." Lena looked, then back at him. "You are describing their relay," she said quietly. "I am describing the shape of their relay," he said, "based on what you told me. I might be wrong." "You are not wrong," she said. Pete made a sound from across the room that was not quite a word. Lena was still looking at Dan. That thing was on her face again. The thing she did not let stay long. It stayed longer this time. "We have been looking at this problem for 6 weeks," she said. Dan shrugged one shoulder. "Fresh eyes." She turned back to the display. Dan, in the same quiet, direct way she had said it at the crash site, with nothing extra attached and nothing performed. He understood by now that when she said it that way, she meant it the way mountains mean being tall. The room came back to life around the display. The web of systems on the map pulsed and shifted as new calculations ran through it. Dan stood at the edge of it all and watched and thought about a power substation in Wyoming and a man who had spent his whole life being useful in situations where no one had thought to explain. The relay went dark 11 hours later. Just dark because 3 redundant systems fed from a single primary source, and the primary source had a fault that Pete's technical team introduced at a location 3, systems away, so carefully and so quietly that it looked like the kind of fault that had always... The consortium's 4 parties lost sight of each other. Within 48 hours, 2 of them had already broken ranks. 1 month after the crash, Lena sat across from Dan in a room that was designed to look like nothing in particular, and it was a comfortable room. It had chairs that fit the shape of a person and light that did not insist on itself. And through the actual window in the actual wall, there was a view of a planet that was green and blue and white in the proportions that meant it. It was not Earth. Lena had her arm back. The support had come off 4 days prior, and she moved it with the cautious attention of someone, relearning a thing they had briefly lost. "The consortium has been referred to the Accord Tribunal," she said. "It will take time." "The man who designed the targeting system," Lena said, "has been identified. He is being collected." Quietly, Dan nodded again. She looked at him. "You have not asked once about any of this." "You would have told me what I needed to know," he said. "Most people," she said carefully, in the position you have been in for the past month, would have asked many questions about what access to my trust might mean for them. Dan looked out the window at the green and blue and white planet. I helped you out of a crashed shuttle, he said. Everything after that was just continuing to be useful while the situation sorted itself out. You identified the relay vulnerability in 20 minutes. I had good information. Dan. Her voice was quiet, the way it had been at the crash site. I am trying to tell you something. He looked at her. I govern 43 systems, she said. I manage resource agreements that run into numbers that have stopped meaning anything to me. The way large distances stop meaning anything. I have advisors and administrators and people whose entire professional lives are dedicated to anticipating problems I have not had yet. She paused. I have not met a single person who helped me without needing something back. The room held that. Dan did not look away. I do not know what to do with that, she said. I am not practiced at it. You don't have to do anything with it, Dan said. You don't owe me a thing. You keep saying that. It keeps being true. She looked at him for a long time, the way she had looked at him at the crash site, deciding whether to trust. Only now the deciding was finished, and she was doing something else with that look. Something he did not have a name for yet, and was not going to name prematurely. I would like to offer you something, she said. I know you do not want that. As a question. He waited. My administration needs someone in a role that does not officially exist, she said. Someone who walks into situations with incomplete information and finds the shape of the problem without needing to be told what shape to look for. Someone who helps because that is what they do, not because of what helping might return. Outside, the green and blue planet turned slowly in the light of its star. The position travels, she said. It is not stable ground. It is the opposite of a cabin in Colorado. Dan thought about the cabin, the alternator that still needed replacing, the 30 years of building something solid and staying inside it. He thought about a relay system 3 systems away going dark from a fault that had been waiting. He looked at her. Is that a job offer? He said. Or something else? She held his gaze. If you want both. The planet turned. Not because of the 43 systems or the numbers that had stopped meaning anything. Not because she ruled more than any map had ever tried to hold. Because she had said thank you like she meant it at a crash site on a cold Colorado ridge, and everything real between them had started there and had not stopped since. Lena looked like someone who had just landed somewhere safe,